pull yourself out of your mother's basement long enough to listen to this podcast because we're talking about Dungeons and Dragons and role-playing games next on Retro Serial. Hey everyone, thanks for joining us today on Retro Serial. I'm your host, Ian C. On today's program, we have reoccurring guest, Dr. Brian Macdonald, to talk about Dungeons and Dragons and role-playing games. I am not going to make a lengthy introduction because I do all that in the interview, so let's just get straight to the interview. However, before we do that, please do me the honor of subscribing to my channel, hitting that thumbs up button, hitting the share button, letting everyone know about the great content you're receiving here on Retro Serial. And if you're interested, hit the bell notification so you don't miss a single episode. And in addition to that, if you're interested in parting with some of your hard-earned cash, I'm going to have links below to both our Buy Me a Coffee page and our Patreon page. And with that said, let's just get straight to the interview. And I have with me Dr. Brian Macdonald from Brains on Games. How you doing, Dr. Brian?
Doing just great. Thanks for having me on.
Oh man, when you contacted me and told me that you like D&D, I thought, what better subject could there be to talk about growing up Generation X than D&D? I mean, what better subject could there be? I mean, really, it was such an iconic part of culture, and it makes sense that you run a game channel, a gaming channel. You'd kind of be into that. So before we jump into it and jump into your background and my background with it, and role-playing games in general, and D&D being a subset of all that and all this stuff, tell us a little bit about your channel and what you do over there on Brains on Games.
Yeah, well, I'm a psychologist and I work with kids and with families. And Brains on Games is really a channel where I talk about family weight board games to encourage parents to play with their kids. There's kind of a focus on the learning skills that can be practiced by playing, because a big part of my job is doing testing for kids with possible learning problems or attention problems. So I do talk about the skills that are developed by playing different kinds of games. And increasingly, I'm getting previews of games before they're released to the public. So I get to give people the inside scoop before the games actually come out to retail.
That's really cool. And actually through gaming is how I met you originally, because a lot of people may not know, I do have another gaming channel, but it didn't really take off. This one took off more, and I did that mistake of where you try to run two YouTube channels and you just shouldn't, especially in part-time. So I was trying to film videos, so one of them went out, and I'm actually glad this one did, because I actually enjoyed this a little bit more. Gaming is just a little bit of a hobby for me. And I'm glad that, it makes more room for people like you who are actually tackling it. And so if anybody's out there and they're into games, board games, all different kinds of games, please go to Brains on Games and subscribe to the channel. It's a great channel.
Thanks so much.
No problem. Hey, let's get right into it. Let's talk about D&D, or let's talk about role games in general. And let's start with just kind of your background, your introduction into that world, and then we can kind of go from there into different kinds and different dice and roll sheets and all that stuff. So
sure.
Tell me about your introduction into this. Geek out for us for a moment.
Yeah. Well, I could talk about the games that I played for hours and hours, but how did it all start? You can probably imagine that a person who spent 11 years in university to finish his education, it was probably bookish when he was a kid. And so I was a big reader, a voracious reader, but I lived in a really small town in Canada. And we had one bookstore in the town. And I had gotten wind of, I was a science fiction reader, but I'd gotten wind of this other genre of fiction, fantasy, novels, but I didn't really know what I was. I would have been 11, 12 years old at the time that I'm remembering back. I didn't really even know what I would ask for at a bookstore or what authors I would ask for. And I'd go to the library, and the librarians had no idea what I was talking about. And so I'd be digging through stacks at the library. And, I was probably 13 years old, and I found a book, but it wasn't a Dungeons and Dragons book. It was like a sociology book about role-playing games.
Oh, okay.
And
Yeah.
like its impact on people and what kinds of people were playing them. And that's how I kind of learned that this Dungeons and Dragons thing existed. And around that time, this is such a weird story. Around that time, I needed braces, but the nearest orthodontist was a couple of hours away. So here's how it would work when I was 13 years old. My dad would schedule some meetings at his head office in the city where the orthodontist was. We'd go, he'd drop me off for his appointment, and he'd work for the day. And then I basically got to run around downtown in the city after my appointment was done. And sometimes I'd go, because they had a big library there too, I'd go to the library, but I found a game store.
Okay. Right on.
I found a game store. So I think the first thing I found was a book by Margaret Weiss and Tracy Hickman, the first in the Dragonlance series. I don't know if you read any of those
I
things.
know Dragonlance series, but I've never read it, but I have heard of it. I do have friends who are well connected to that world. So
So I found Dragonlance, and that is a story. It was published by TSR, who are the publishers of Dungeons and Dragons, and it was sort of tied in with a series of Dungeons and Dragons modules. I couldn't really find the modules even at the game store. By the time I was getting into the stuff, at least where I lived, that those kinds of things specifically were hard to find.
So
what's
what's a module?
Oh boy! Okay,
I don't mean to sound stupid, but I have a loose connection to that world. I don't have an in-depth connection, of course, so I don't know what module means.
So back to basics, right?
Right.
So when you're looking at most role-playing games, Dungeons and Dragons is one of them. There are what you would call core books or core rule books, and those are kind of the basic rules. This is how you play the game. These are the tools that you need to get started. And then they have separate books, usually smaller ones. Sometimes they'd sell them in boxes with a whole bunch of extra accessories that would have a story, an adventure that the players would go on. So basically that would mean the person who was running the game, if it was Dungeons and Dragons, that would be the dungeon master, but most games would say the game master. The dungeon master often would write up their own stories. I think these role-playing games were sort of a haven for writers and frustrated actors who were,
right.
If you look at actors now and writers, a lot of them are playing these kinds of games. But the modules or the adventures were a way so that the dungeon master didn't have to come up with everything on their own. They didn't have to write it themselves.
Yeah.
So it kind of made it easier, and you'd have maps, and like I said, sometimes there would be like handouts for the players that might be some object or something that they were finding, or there would be pictures that you could show them. Because there's no screens, it's just a bunch of people sitting around a table. It's rolling dice.
Yeah, and imagination in your score sheets or your character sheets and things like that. So you got to this game store and you found this book, and tell me a little bit about your getting sucked into that world.
Yeah, well, I started, like I said, with Dragonlance, and I ate those things up. Now I knew what I could ask for at the bookstore, and so I was able to get the books the Dragonlance, the novels. So I wasn't yet playing the game. For Christmas that year, I got the D&D Red Box, the 3rd edition. It would have been. I recognize that now. At the time, I had no idea. This was the 3rd version of it. But in the early 80s, Dungeons and Dragons kind of split in two.
Okay.
So
tell us about that split.
Yeah. So the original Dungeons and Dragons was published in 1974. And then later on in the late 70s, TSR was trying to get new players into the game, or they were realizing that like high school students were playing and they needed a simplified version of the game that they called basic D&D. And like I said, the version I had was in a red box, and they recently reissued a red box version of Dungeons and Dragons. But so what they were doing around the same time, they were trying to get new people, younger people into the game by creating a basic rule set that was sort of simplify things. And at the same time, one of the creators of Dungeons and Dragons, Gary Gygax, was trying to formalize the rules so that it could be played in tournaments at conventions.
Oh, okay.
And that became Advanced Dungeons and Dragons. So now there were really the original Dungeons and Dragons, and then AD&D, and the basic Dungeons and Dragons set, which, like I said, my version was the red box. By the time the third edition came out, there was a red box, and that was for players from levels 1 to 3. And then there was, I want to say, a green box, and a blue box was the expert level, and then a black box that was master, and you could go all the way up to the godly levels of Dungeons and Dragons. But I started with the basic D&D, the red box.
Okay. So that's amazing to me that it came out in 1974. I had actually no idea. And then you've gotten into it when you were 13, and if memory serves me right, that would have put it about mid 80s. Is that correct?
83, 84. 83, 84 was when I got into it.
Okay. And by that time, see, my exposure to Dungeons and Dragons was that this was the devil's game, and that if you play this, for sure you are going to go to hell. No, I heard that, but that wasn't like a big deal in my house. There was no anti Dungeons and Dragons. But growing up, evangelical, I did hear people talk about that. But it wasn't like this big thing in my world or anything like that. I think we were just interested in other things. I know that there's a couple questions I wanted to ask you, because it was crazy that it came out in 74. So what was the biggest difference between the 74 version and the version that you started on? What's name a rule that changed? What or something like that, what was the difference between those?
The biggest thing I remember, because at the time I found it a little bit frustrating, because the booklets and supplements that you could get for something like Dragonlance, which is what I was interested in at first, because that was the very first thing that I read that was related to Dungeons and Dragons directly. Those were written for Advanced Dungeons and Dragons, but I was playing from the basic box. And what I recall the most was that the races and classes in the game were sort of tied together. So if you were playing, they called it a halfling, I think, by the time I got to it, but the original Dungeons and Dragons called it a hobbit.
Okay.
But they got into some trouble with the author of a book that had some hobbits in it.
Wonder what book that is.
I don't know. What could that be? So they changed the name to halfling, but basically that's what it was. But if you wanted to be a halfling, you couldn't be a halfling wizard in the basic set. You were always going to be the rogue, the thief, the pickpocket. If you wanted to be a wizard, you were going to be an elf, as I remember. Elves were only wizards. If you wanted to be an elf, you had to be a wizard. Or maybe they had a wizard fighter hybrid class or something. But anyway, you didn't have really a choice. You chose your race, and that was or you chose your class, and it was going to be a certain race in the game. So you couldn't be an orc or a half elf or whatever in the basic set, and the main character in the Dragonlance novels was a half elf whose name was Tanis Half Elven, if I remember right. It's been many years since I read those books.
That's interesting, because whenever I played, I always played a half elf. I don't know why. Well, I think because I kind of wanted to, at the time, kind of recreate some type of assassin ninja kind of character. And so I needed the nimbleness of an elf, but I also kind of needed the strength of a warrior. So I did half elf, half human. sheets when I was into it brief, or whenever I would play. They would say, well, what do you play? And I always say, well, I play a half elf. And I was never really like super into it or anything, but I did play with people every now and again. I'd be like, they'd break out the boards and stuff like that, and the books, or they'd be like, hey, we're coming over to do this. And, this guy's made this, this dungeon master's made this elaborate sheet or whatever. And I also remember the books too, being in the bookstore and opening the books. And this would have been, for me, late 80s, maybe about 90. I think the very first time I actually played an official game, I think I was either 17 or 18 when I played an official game. I had seen people play games. I had been around. I had looked at the books. I thought it was cool. I loved the cartoon Dungeons and Dragons, which we'll get into maybe a little bit. And I love the whole idea. I was really, sword and sorcery kind of films and stuff, Conan and Yor and what some of those other Beastmaster. I loved those movies. Those were great movies. So I always had an interest in it. I never really connected with the group. But I also remember the first time I did play. I was also introduced. This is going to be way off the rail, but I was also introduced to the band Skinny Puppy.
Oh my gosh!
Were you a Skinny Puppy fan or no?
You know what? I think I had some Skinny Puppy cassettes, and I was introduced to them through my university radio station.
Yeah,
I went to the university.
Right, left. I think they called it left of the dial radio stations or something like that. Yeah, college rock kind of radio stations. Yeah. Well, I was down there when I was with some friends. And they're like, well, let's play some D&D. And there were some people I didn't know. I knew one person who knew them. And they're like, we're going to play some D&D. And, what's your shit? And I'm like, okay. And I was really into music. And I was like, oh, so what are your favorite bands? And they're like Skinny Puppy. And they started playing. I'm like, okay, I've never heard Skinny Puppy before. But we're going to play it and listen and play some D&D. Listen to some early alternative rock there. Now, I do remember the books too. Those were very interesting to look at all the skill for artwork in those books. And some of it is straight up looks evil. And again, in my culture, there was a backlash that you shouldn't play this. When I played it, I didn't understand why they would think that. Other than there is some connection with evil and spells and magic and things like that, and I understand that. Did you get that backlash at all? Did you run into the anti-D&D group?
Well, like I said, I was playing in a small town. I was running the game. I rarely got to play.
You were
eventually,
the guy
I was the dungeon master, but eventually my cousin took on some dungeon master duties, and I got to play in his game Dungeons and Dragons a little bit, and then we played Top Secret, and we can get into all the games that I played. I had to list them out. I couldn't just name them all off the top of my head. But so I didn't get the controversy, but I don't think anybody really knew what we were doing, what we were up to. Even though the other players were talking about it at school or whatever. It really started, I think, that controversy in the late 70s. There was a guy, late 70s to early 80s. There was a fella, a university student. He was only 16 in Michigan. His name was James Dallas Egbert. Okay. And he was a player of Dungeons and Dragons, but he was going through some mental health things. And he had gone into these steam tunnels near the university and disappeared. Wow. And the family hired a private investigator who discovered that he was playing Dungeons and Dragons. And then I guess he was talking to the press about it or something. And he said, yeah, these guys are doing these live action. They're playing Dungeons and Dragons, and then they're acting it out in the tunnels near the university. And this guy just got lost or something, or disappeared, or they didn't know what happened to him. He turned up later, but eventually committed suicide. He had gone into the tunnels to harm himself. He didn't kill himself. but he'd gone into the tunnels to harm himself, and then eventually did succeed in committing suicide. But because the detective had talked to the papers about this guy was a Dungeons and Dragons player, somebody else took that idea and ran with it and wrote a fictionalized version of the story called Mazes and Monsters.
Yeah, I just watched that movie. I was going to say, this sounds a lot like Mazes and Monsters. I
Yeah.
mean, this is very, very close. So,
Yeah. It was sort of based on the same story. And that was, Mazes and Monsters was that the first thing Tom Hanks did? Was Bosom Buddies before that? That was a Tom Hanks movie.
yeah, I don't remember. It was definitely around that time, you know.
So 1982 was the Tom Hanks movie, and there was a Canadian movie soon after that was about a person who played Dungeons and Dragons, and it turned him into a serial killer, and that was in the early 80s. And in still early 80s, in 1982, there was a high school student who committed suicide, and his mom, whose name was Patricia Pulling, blamed his death on Dungeons and Dragons. Because in fact, she sued the high school principal because that's where the kids were playing D&D, and someone in the group had cast a curse on, or had put a curse on the guy in the game. His character in the game had some sort of a death curse put on him, and she believed that curse was real, and so sued the school and sued TSR for the death of her son, and they threw that out of court because
good. I was gonna
right.
ask if it was a successful lawsuit or not, but they didn't.
Yeah, she wasn't successful. I think the judge said, well, there's no such thing as curses in real life. Like you can't really do that. And then she formed a group, a lobbying group called Bothered About Dungeons and Dragons. Bad.
Oh no.
Yeah, and
Kinda
so
like
bad,
mad, and
yeah, exactly right. So by 1983, she was sort of lobbying to get this thing out of schools and out of publication because it's satanic and it's causing all kinds of perversions and cannibalism and death and Satanism. Satanism was a big one.
Yeah, I remember that. I remember the Satanism one. I remember too that there was a religious component to the anti-Dungeons and Dragons, but there was also the it's not good psychologically for you component too. That you're going to get too wrapped up in these characters, that you kind of live them out, and that. Did you hear? I mean, obviously you didn't experience any of this. I didn't even know anybody experienced any of this. But did you hear about those kind of things?
Probably not until I started university in '89. So I was living in a little bit of a bigger city, and those things had been going on for a while by then. There was a story on 60 Minutes about how bad Dungeons and Dragons was for you, but I mean, really, the only negative connotations I experienced was that if you played that stuff instead of, going out to a party with your friends, that you were a nerd.
Yeah.
Right. Well, and I knew I was a nerd already, so I guess that wasn't the end of the world for me.
Right. You're like, hey, I'm already here. I'm already flagged down in this camp of nerdom. So I mean, this is just the particular way I'm nerding out. Did you have? Did you have any people in your circle or anything like that you felt that they were taking it too far, or did you see any steps in that direction or anything like that?
I mean, it was like it's an activity where you can get really into it, right? Because it's an exciting story that you're a part of. Usually, like if you have a good dungeon master who's running the game, it's an exciting story. And there are some games that I like to this day, 30 years later, almost 40 years later, I still remember certain things that happened in some of those games. We flipped from game to game through high school. So it wasn't like we all, got super sucked into one. Mm-hmm. There was one game where it wasn't a satanic kind of influence that would get people sucked in. It was a game called Paranoia. And this was a game, and it was a humor game that West End Games published in the early 80s. But it was sort of a combination of 1984 and Monty Python and Brazil and like all these weird influences together. It was about a paranoid computer who was worried about communist infiltration and secret societies and mutant powers, and all of the players, their job was to eliminate those threats, but each of them were members of secret societies and have mutant powers. So they're all looking at each other through the entire game and they were all trying to catch one another doing something wrong. So anytime somebody said something out of character, it just became a big fight at the table.
Oh, okay. I gotcha.
And they, there were constant displays of loyalty to the computer, and like, just, it was all, all in good fun, right? Everybody was just joking around, but I remember they were singing a song. I left the table for a minute to get a pizza or something that was coming to the door, and the players were singing at the top of their lungs about the computer that they were supposed to be following in the game.
So it can get a little out of hand. The thing is anything can get out of hand. I mean, I was really into martial arts. I mean, I probably would have been into D&D that way, but I should say this. I know how it is to be into something that's a hobby, but it's more than a hobby. It's a passion, and a passion in the sense that it's not like part of my work or part, what I mean, or part of family or whatever, but it's something else that's more than a hobby, but less than like, less than a total lifestyle. And I was like that way with martial arts. So I definitely understand. I mean, I was at class all week, I mean, I was there, I mean, I was really interested in pursuing this part of my life. And I get it. I get that, we had struggles too. Like, you should be studying. And I'm like, I know, but I gotta pass this test, or I don't have this form down quite correctly, or, you know what I mean? And then you'd go out to coffee with your friends afterwards, and we'd talk about our class, and we'd talk about what was going on, and, the politics of martial arts. So I get being wrapped up in that world. Now, I mentioned that I played D&D probably for the first time at 17. That is not the first time I ever played a role-playing game, though. I played and so we're going to branch out here into like what is role-playing games and different role-playing games other than D&D. And then we can go back to D&D if there's something specific you want to say about it. Don't
Sure.
let me know. But the very first role-playing game that I played was a Star Trek game. And it had a sheet that had these little octagons on it, or hexagons, I can't remember. And this is where you were in space. And I was a Klingon. We were the Klingons because my friend's older brother was the Federation, and so he was going to be the good guy because he was the older brother and he got to choose first. So we had to be the Klingons. We had to be the bad guys. And so I remember playing that game. So talk about what is a role-playing game? Why do they call it a role-playing game? And some of the other role-playing games that are out there and were pervasive in your childhood and growing up.
Yeah, so a role-playing game is really what you're doing is getting a group of people together, and you're basically working together to create a story. And when you say, you can get really deep into it, and it can take over a part of your life. Well, it's like you're writing a novel with your friends.
Yeah.
And so you can. I mean, I don't know, if my son was spending his time drawing maps and writing stories instead of playing video games, I think that wouldn't necessarily be a bad thing. But it is about creating a shared story. And there are some rules and parameters that guide how you do that and what happens to the characters in the story along the way. The dungeon master or game master is sort of the computer that runs the program. That's the person who controls all the other characters and decides what happens in the world. And they're sort of writing the plot of the story, while the characters in the game are the ones who decide what it is that they want to do and where the story goes.
Okay. All right. Yeah. All right. So, does it have anything to do? Does role playing mean like you're creating a role that you're playing, or does it have to do with the role that there's a large amount of dice that you roll? I've always
No, it
wondered
is.
that.
Yeah, it is. It's role, ROLE. So it is the character that you're creating. And some games use less dice, honestly. And there are some role playing games that don't use dice at all. I seem to remember one called Toon. I read the rule book for Toon. I think it was by Steve Jackson Games, and it was sort of a Looney Tune style game where you could just do anything.
Ah,
It was just trying to create a funny story with your friends.
well, you know what? I probably should have known that by the way it's spelled, but I'm an idiot. I mean, I'm a moron. Really, that's all there is. And I'm trying to let everybody know here that I am not the sharpest tack in the box for sure. But what were some of the other games out there that you played, and that were you just strictly D&D, or did you do other role playing games?
Well, honestly, D&D was probably the least the game that I played the least out of all of them. It was the one that
Oh,
I started out with, but it wasn't the one that I played the most. We had a, a little bit a little bit of fun playing. Well, we had a lot of fun playing, but we didn't spend a lot of time playing Top Secret SI, which was like a spy role playing game that was published by the same people who put out D&D. We did spend a lot of time playing that Paranoia game because we just found it was hilarious, and so it was a good way to kind of have a few laughs with your friends. We had the campaign. So a campaign in a role playing game is a story that lasts over time, where you're not just meeting for one night to play through the entire story, but it goes on and it continues, and the characters develop. We had a campaign that lasted probably a year or two in the DC Heroes role playing game. So everybody created
oh,
like comic book superheroes, and we played that. We did play the Star Trek one, not until I got into university though. So that would have been early 1990, probably. I played I think I want to say FASA put that one out. But yeah, that was kind of the next one because role playing stopped in between. I left my high school group, so got to university. I didn't know anybody who was playing those kinds of games, and I don't know at the time if they had a club or anything like that. Now, many universities have a game club where you can get together and find other people who play. There's a game store downtown that I used to visit here in Ottawa, and they always had like signs on the bulletin board looking for players, looking for a dungeon master with the little tear off strips where you could take the person's phone number,
yeah.
pre-internet, right? Um, yeah, so that was at the game store. So then, yeah, so in my undergraduate degree, we did Star Trek. I played one game, I think, literally only one afternoon we spent playing the Marvel Superheroes game, which was also a TSR one. And there was a little bit of interest in a series of books that fell under the World of Darkness, it was called, by White Wolf Games.
Okay.
Vampire the Masquerade was the first one, and that's still around. They made a TV show out of it in the 90s, and I think it's coming back as a TV show, but it's coming back in board game form as well. And video games. There have been video games based on that. And that was a game that sort of jumped off from Anne Rice's vampire novels. It was sort of a story where the players play as the vampires, but they're kind of tragic characters.
Yeah.
Um, and it was way more depressing than the kinds of games that I was used to playing. So we didn't stick with that for too long.
The, the last game, role playing game that I was part of was probably back in 10, somewhere around there. And it was a friend of mine who did a vampire one. He actually kind of wrote the story. So, yeah, I remember that one pretty well. That was the last, and he was a friend. So I played with him, but I kind of came in mid-season. There were people who were already playing, and I
Right.
don't, and then they kind of begrudgingly let me in halfway through as a new character, and I only played about 3 or 4 times, as I recall, and then I just kind of got out of it. I wasn't as interested in it anymore. But I do know that's a thing. Like, it's not just sci-fi, and it's not just sword and sorcery. It's vampires now too, or something like that.
Yeah, and they combine fantasy and science fiction in Shadowrun, which is a cyberpunk game that has elves and dwarves and magic.
Okay.
So, and cyberpunk was a thing in the 80s as well, right? There was a cyberpunk role-playing game. Now there's a computer game that just came out this year. I have 2 teenage kids now, and when I first pulled out Dungeons and Dragons again, they were fascinated with it. It's hard to have time as an adult to put this stuff together, I think.
Right.
But I introduced it to my kids and their friends, so they would come over once a month or every 6 weeks or so, and we'd play a game of D&D. And when I was running it, I found it was a lot of fun because I was introducing the kids to it. When I played in someone else's game of D&D, I just found it frustrating.
Oh, really? You found it frustrating? When
Yeah,
you're
as
not...
an adult, I found it frustrating. And the reason why is that I've played some games that were developed long after D&D that had some features that, like, going back to D&D, I'm like, oh, it's so dependent on the dice. Like, why isn't it like this other game that I really like? And I just couldn't get the kids to try out this other game. They wanted to play D&D because that was the one they knew.
Well, what do you mean it's not other games aren't dependent upon the dice?
Well, a game. So, for example, Top Secret was a game that was meant to be like a movie-style spy, like James Bond style. There was a James Bond role-playing game. I never played that one, but Top Secret was supposed to be like that. And one of the features of Top Secret that D&D never adopted, as far as I know, was that you could earn these fame and fortune points, and you could spend them to alter a die roll or to make yourself successful on something that you otherwise would have failed. The game I played the most and the longest was a game called Torg, Torg.
Okay.
Which is a silly name, and really it's an acronym. It stands for the other role-playing game, because Dungeons and Dragons was the popular one when Torg was published in 1990. But it refers to something within the game. But I thought that game was really cool, and we had a 4-year campaign going.
That's
years
crazy.
In university. And with the same characters and the same story that just continued and continued. And we liked that game because the story of the game is that all of these creatures had invaded Earth, but they brought with it their own reality. So there was an area of the world in the UK that was fantasy, and there was a Victorian horror reality that you could go to. There was sort of a Land of the Lost style and Jurassic Park style world where they had there were dinosaurs and things, but it was all in the same game.
Oh wow!
And so
it's like crossing universes together into a game.
and it all worked together. I mean, our group had there was a ninja, and so we had a ninja. There was a spy who was turned into a vampire over the course of the game's history. We had and they were teamed up with the demon, and the 3 of them were running around doing missions and trying to save the world.
Yeah.
And so that was a game where, I mean, the reason why all of these different realities were invading was because Earth had all the possibility, the energy of reality, and there were so many possibilities, and they were trying to steal Earth's possibility energy, and the characters had these possibility points that they could spend to re-roll or add a higher total to their die rolls. And it just meant that you weren't always risking total failure at any given time.
No, that's good.
The players also had cards they could play that would improve their rolls or their stats. So once I went back to Dungeons and Dragons, I missed those. I missed those options.
Yeah, okay. And Dungeons and Dragons doesn't have those options.
No, it's based on your skill in the die roll. So if you mess it up, it gets messed up. Unless you have a really good dungeon master who can kind of still, keep it fun and light and moving along, despite the fact that you've failed miserably in something that you wanted to do.
For you as a fan of this, I'm sure, like anything, there are times where this is like, man, that game was not good. I didn't care for it. I didn't like it. And then there's other times where it's like exciting for you. What makes the difference for you as somebody who's into role-playing games? What is a good game? Like, man, that was awesome. That was great. And then what's a bad game for people who are in that world?
Well, I mean, it's almost always good when you're hanging out with your friends, right? Something to do with your friends. So that certainly makes it better. So even a bad game is good when you're hanging out with people who you like. And when I was playing with my kids, that was fantastic. They wanted to play with their dad. You know, I'm never going to say no to that. I think what would make a bad game is when you're spending more time flipping through rule books to look up a particular chart for a certain result, and everyone is waiting.
Uh-huh.
Everyone is waiting. Now, I know that myself as a dungeon master or a game master would probably drive some players crazy, because I would rather make it up than find the specific chart. So I was always about move it along, move it along, move it along.
Oh,
We're not going to spend time getting bogged down in the rules. I'm the boss. I get to decide what the rules are.
right.
But it was always in the service of keeping the story moving. And when the story gets stuck and bogged down with looking for a particular chart or a statistic, it drags.
Yeah. Well, did
It
you ever
drags.
get some stories that just weren't as exciting for you, or stories that were more exciting, or we just like, or is it kind of like any basic story will do? Just you've got to have the right dungeon master and the right people around you.
I mean, if you've got the right people, it's always good. It doesn't matter the story, because you're making the story. So,
Okay.
you're making, and you can go online now on YouTube and you can watch videos of all kinds of different people playing Dungeons and Dragons or other games that are similar, like Pathfinder. And you can see what a good dungeon master can do, so the story, you know, it's important, I suppose, but it's more the character interaction that's fun,
Mm-hmm.
and the joking around and the trash talk and all the stuff that happens among the players, the little competitions that you get going. If you've got a good group, you make it fun. It doesn't matter what the story is. Like I said, as long as you're not like spending all your time flipping through rule books and trying to find some arcane statistic or something that
Right.
you want to keep the players engaged and keep the story moving along, I think.
Okay. All right. Now, you've also mentioned that you say beginner, advanced, and intermediate and stuff like that. What's the difference between that? What would you say is the difference between is it beginner, advanced, or intermediate, advanced? Is it the player or is it the game that makes it that?
Well, yeah, some of the games are really complicated.
Okay.
No question about it.
Could so it's complicated, so that means like I would like if you were having me play D&D with you or another role playing game with you, would you start with something that's less complicated? Or I mean, would these be like rules I would already have to know, or is it more like, hey man, you're in for an education here, can you handle that if we're going to play this advanced game? Which is it?
Well, for the dungeon master or the game master, more complicated rules do make things more complicated. You need to be more experienced to
Okay.
be able to figure out, the ins and outs of how a game is going to work. And it helps if you've practiced the storytelling part of it,
Mm-hmm.
because that is such a big, being able to change your voice or do crazy accents, or what that always, my kids are always like, that's what dragged them into it. If you spoke with the lisp for one of the characters, they were like, oh, they could just imagine what that person was like, and they really
Right.
enjoyed that when we used to do that. So for the dungeon master, it takes a more experienced dungeon master to play a more complicated game. For the players, again, if you've got a good game master and you've got a group who can help them along, usually you don't have to be too experienced if you're open to playing a game like that.
So
The
is the
other players
difference
will help.
between like like you said, these were advanced games and these were beginner games? Is the difference just a little bit it's simpler or something like that? Is this a little bit more? There's not as many nuances or are
They Yeah, what they did with basic versus advanced Dungeons and Dragons is that you had the advanced system that had statistics and odds and charts for everything.
oh
What are the
okay
odds that you're going to find a singing sword in a pile of treasure? There's a chart for that. What are the odds that you're going to be able to climb up a 100-foot rope without falling? There's a chart that you would roll on for that. That did make it more complicated. Whereas they called it basic D&D versus advanced D&D. The basic set simplified the character creation because you weren't there weren't as many options to choose from, and it kept things tight because you were working with like one small book instead of 3 hardcovers for Dungeons and Dragons. Now there's the Dungeon Master Guide, the Player's Handbook, and the Monster Manual, plus all of the supplements about the settings or the different character class options and all the other things that go along with it. So rather than having everything spread out across 25 different books that you might have to look through, those box sets that I first started playing kept it down to a minimum. They reduced the options so that you weren't kind of overwhelmed and overloaded by all the different choices that you're going to be faced with when you're trying to create a character or make up a story. And it just made it tight in that this book only has the rules for the first 3 levels. So
I gotcha.
Once you're up to level 3, you've learned it by then.
Would you ever be like in a situation where, like, if you're trying to play in advance and you didn't have all the stuff, you're like, so this monster comes out and you're like, what's this monster do? And you're like, man, I don't got that book yet. We don't know. We can only imagine what this guy can do. I mean, he's here and we don't have the book that tells us what he does. Does he suck our power, or does he chop our arms off, or we'll get that book next time?
Well, if he was going to show up in one of my games, then I would have made something up to go along with it, whether or not I had the book, right? That's why I think I said before, it's the idea where if you're a person who wished he could be a writer, you're going to make up that story as the dungeon master, and if a monster shows up, you're going to have some idea about what that monster can do.
Okay. Well, I would be remiss not to ask. I got a couple more questions that are just coming to my mind, but I would be totally remiss. This show is about growing up Generation X, and we're talking about role-playing games. Let's talk about Star Wars role-playing games. What? What was that? Is that a sigh of like, oh yeah, I want to talk about it? Is that a sigh of like, I could care less about Star Wars role-playing games?
Listen, I love Star Wars. What am I going to tell you? You can't be a nerd in the 80s and not love Star Wars. It's just not possible. I love Star Wars, but I love the 2nd edition West End Game Star Wars role-playing manual, the book, because it was this beautiful hardcover with the great big picture of Darth Vader on the front. And the pages were glossy inside, and they included like advertisements as if you're in the Star Wars universe. There were like propaganda posters for the Rebels and the Empire. There were ads for different blasters and for the company that made TIE fighters. I don't remember all the names of these companies, but I just thought it was such a beautiful, cool book just by itself, even if you didn't play the game. Yeah. That was a gorgeous, you know what? It's still on my shelf.
Oh, cool. Really?
I still have that. 1992 was when I wrote it down specifically. The 2nd edition. I didn't get the 1st edition. I wasn't, I guess, into the Star Wars role playing early enough, or I didn't see the 1st edition until after the 2nd edition came out. But I did play the 2nd edition.
Did they have Star Wars role playing games while the movies were being released still, or was that later? Did they have like in 1981? An Empire Strikes Back role-playing game or something based on Star Wars during that time, or was that
not in
later?
81? Not in 81. Not even in 83 when Jedi would have come out. I think that was later. I think it was mid to late 80s when the 1st edition, because the 2nd edition was 92, so it would have been like 89 probably would have been the earliest, or 88. I don't have the date in front of me for the 1st edition of it. But they did include source books for all of the, like, for planets that were in the movies and for the, things that popped up in the movies themselves. There were tons of just like the action figures and the play sets, you could find anything once they started publishing the Star Wars role-playing game, information about anything. In fact, I read that when Timothy Zahn was hired to write those books, the Thrawn trilogy of Star Wars novels.
Mm-hmm.
They sent him the second edition role-playing game rulebook.
Really? So
So
he could
that
reference those things.
a lot of the things from the movies, like the races, didn't really have names until they codified them in the rulebook.
Yeah.
And so they wanted it to be consistent for Thrawn, I guess.
Well, I've got a real obscure reference to a role-playing game. It was in a movie, and in the movie they had a video game of this character, and they had a role-playing game that's hinted at. And me and my friends actually tried to recreate this game because we were such fans of this movie. It was called Cloak and Dagger. Do you remember that movie, Cloak and Dagger?
Yes.
And it was about a video. There's a video game, and that's where like the secret information was. But if you remember in the movie, he's got a role-playing game of Cloak and Dagger with I think the guy's name, it's about this kid who has this overactive imagination, and his dad plays both the role-playing guy and his dad in real life, and it's a very interesting show. But I remember it was the character in the show that they made the role-playing game that he kind of imagined his name was Jack Flack, or yeah, I think it was Flack, and he had the bulletproof hat and stuff like that. And I don't know if you remember that it was hinted at a role-playing game as well as a video game in there. And me and my friends, we tried to recreate that. We had these little, they were like Iron Eagle, kind of like off the beaten path type of figures. And we would try to go on these adventures in our backyard. And what made the difference is my friend would try to stop me, and I would try to, I'd be Jack Flack because I was the good guy if I could ever be the good guy. And I couldn't win all the time. So we rolled dice to make sure that it was going to be fair. So you'd say like, well, he's going to escape this trap or something, or he's going to go in and he's going to go in a room. There's going to be 3 guys. Is he going to be able to beat them all up? And then you'd have to roll the dice to see if he wins or dies or something like that. So tell me about some obscure, that even if you're in role-playing games, some games that are more underground than underground.
Okay. Oh boy.
If you can, I don't know. Yeah.
Well, I mentioned
that one was pretty obscure,
very obscure.
There's
very
not even,
obscure.
it's not, I don't even think it's a real game. It was made up for the movie, and my friends and I tried to recreate the movie, the game that referenced in the movie. So.
Oh boy, an obscure role play. Well, I mentioned Torg. I think Torg is obscure enough, but
okay.
There was a game that I played for a while. You know what? And I maybe only ran a game of this twice, but I thought the source books were cool and the idea was cool. And it was a horror role-playing game and it came from Sweden, I think, called Cult with a K.
Ah.
And the idea of this game was that reality is an illusion, and people whose lives are kind of stable just accept it for what it is, sort of like the Matrix. But this was long before the Matrix ever came out. Some people who are in some sort of extreme distress, like drug addiction and things like that, or if they're going insane, they can pierce the veil and see what the real world is like. And it was a game that I think I picked it up because you could basically run if you wanted to. Remember that Hellraiser movie?
Oh yeah.
Right, with the Cenobites, with the like Pinhead with all the nails in his head.
Yeah.
You basically could have those things in this game.
Oh, okay.
And so, like I said, we only played it a couple of times, but everyone in the story that we were doing went insane, and so it didn't last very long because they were all becoming killers or being killed themselves. But I just really thought it was neat that you could play these horror movies and I like Clive Barker.
Okay.
And,
All
and,
right.
so that's one that I don't hear talked about very much. I don't know that it's super underground, but I don't hear about cult very much. I think there was a second edition that came out a few years later,
Yeah,
but
you might. I'm really into music, and I'm always hearing about bands that I've never heard of before, and and I'm into gaming, and I always hear about games I've never heard before. So I just didn't know. Wasn't sure if there's you can be into role playing games for 5-10 years, and then somebody comes along and says, "Oh, have you heard of this?" And be like, "I've never even heard of that." Like, well, it didn't get off the ground. It was really kind of obscure. So I know that kind of stuff exists in every yeah. Okay, go ahead.
you said that didn't get off the ground, and that reminded me of one. Now, I don't remember the name of this game. I never played it because it was never published, but I thought, what a crazy idea for a role-playing game. I think it went to Kickstarter and maybe got funded, but they never delivered on the game itself. And it was a game where kids who were playing whatever the version of Dungeons and Dragons was in the game really were actually summoning demons, and
Oh, okay.
it really was making them evil, and the players were trying to stop these kids from doing all the terrible things and so the things that all the parents were scared of in the 80s are really happening in this role-playing game, and the players were trying to put a stop to it somehow. So I thought, what a funny idea for a game.
Yeah.
But it never ever came out.
Stupid question. But was there ever a Christian role playing game? Because I know that there are Christian, like you have heavy metal, then you have like Christian heavy metal, and you have there are Christian board games out there. I have a few of them myself, but I just didn't know if they ever tried to get in on that market or not. Um,
Honestly,
it could be a no because they were so against it. But every once in a while, you have somebody have some idea that, what, they've got Monopoly. Let's do Christian Monopoly with crosses and stuff like that.
there might be something now
Uh-huh.
that I'm not aware of, but back in the 80s and early 90s when I was frequenting the game shops, I don't remember ever seeing anything like that.
Yeah, it
There,
could totally be a no.
I mean, there are games where Christian clerics could perform miracles, but it wasn't like the focus wasn't the Christian. It wasn't the religion, wasn't the
Right.
focus. It just so happened that miracles were real, and certain people could invoke them.
It sounds like I'm thinking about this now. This sounds more like an SNL skit or something. That would exist in reality. I just wondered if you had known about any. But yeah, I do know that there were in that vampire game that that my friend played. There was clerics. There were actual like ministers and stuff like that. That was part of the game. So I guess that kind of comes the closest to it. I guess if
and they could affect the vampire somehow, and they could affect.
Yeah.
There was a so that vampire game was associated with a bunch of other games in that under that World of Darkness label. But there was a werewolf one and one about mummies, but there was one about ghosts as well. And I think that the ministers and rabbis and other sort of religious characters maybe played more of a role in that one too.
Yeah, interesting. So what do you think? I'm going to wrap it up here. So I got two questions for you. If somebody wants to start on role-playing game, they listen to this like, yeah, that sounds cool. I want to start. Where would you start them?
Well, you know what? It's real easy to get into Dungeons and Dragons now, because the thing that used to be the basic box set, you can basically you can download a starter set now for free from Wizards of the Coast now as the publisher. So you can get the basic rules as a PDF and a starting adventure. All you need is a set of dice, and those are easy to track down at I'd say your local game store. Even you could probably find on Amazon too if you wanted to go online.
Right. We have them at our bookstore. We have them, you have them at, I think, Walmart and Target and stuff in the gaming section. You can find the dice. What's the future? What do you think the future of this is? Um, I'm kind of wondering if technology has affected it in any way. I mean, you're always going to have the book and the sheet in front of you and the dice and that kind of thing. But do you see the future of this going anywhere as far as role playing game is concerned?
Well, I think the pandemic has changed things a little bit. Certainly in my life, it has changed things in terms of role playing games. There are multiple companies that allow for online role playing. One of them is called Roll20, and there's another called Foundry. And I haven't used Foundry, but after the pandemic started and gaming groups couldn't get together, my old university roommates got in touch with me online and said, we want to do this game with our kids and we're going to do it on Roll20. Do you want to join in? And so myself and two of my roommates and two of their kids are doing this thing on Roll20 where you're on your PC and you have a camera. So I can see the other players at the bottom of the screen, and we can talk to each other. They can hear us speaking to each other through the webcams. You can press a button and it rolls all the dice. You can see dice rolling across the screen.
Oh, cool.
You've got a big map and you can move your figures around the map and it lights up depending on where you are. So one person is the game master and we all play. And we get together once a week with people. Listen, I haven't seen those people in 15 years. And now we get together once a week and I've met their kids.
Oh, cool.
Amazing.
Yeah.
I think amazing. And the kids are into it. I think it's just fantastic when it brings people together like that. So I do think, I mean, it's never going to totally replace an in-person gaming group because that's obviously the most fun, but it's so convenient to use something like Roll20 where you just, you sign in and one person has some rule books that they've purchased on that system and you can play a game without leaving your house and you're still sort of together with your friends like it's a Zoom call.
Right. Yeah, cool. All right, Dr. Brian, tell us again about your channel, how people can reach you, or not reach you, but, get in contact with you. No, not get in contact with you, how they can stalk you. I'm wondering how you can tell people how they can better stalk you. No, sure. Tell people about your channel one more time, and everybody go and subscribe.
Brains on Games is the channel, and it is about family board games and playing with your kids. You can search it up on YouTube, or you can find Brains on Games on Twitter or Instagram or Facebook.
Right on. And are you thinking of now making another channel specifically about D&D or role-playing games?
Like you, I recognize that there's not enough time for two of those things. Now, have I participated in other conversations like this about role-playing games? There's a company called Mastermind Games that has created a game called Quest Adventures, and it's specifically designed to help kids on the autism spectrum with social skills.
Oh, cool.
So, of course, that's something that I wanted to talk to them about. So we've had some conversations about that stuff on Clubhouse, actually.
Cool. Send me some of that stuff. We might use that at the school. My wife might use that at the school. So
fantastic. Yeah, I'll send you the link right away. You can get in touch with those folks.
Okay. All right. Thank you. All right, everyone. Dr. Brian Macdonald, check him out. Brains on Games. Go and subscribe if you haven't already subscribed. He's got a great channel. And while you're thinking about subscribing and hitting the thumbs up button, why don't you do that for me? If I've earned your like, please hit the like button. And if you want to subscribe, please do. It means the world to me that you do that. It really helps us out here. And share it on your favorite social media if you like talking about everything retro, growing up 70s, 80s, 90s, and a little bit before and a little bit beyond. Well, you're at the right place. Let everybody know about this channel. Also, if you're interested in parting with some of your hard-earned cash, you can. I have both a Patreon page and a Buy Me a Coffee page where you can donate the money you're not using and let me use that money for you to build this YouTube mogul empire. If you're listening to this on podcast only, thank you. Please leave me an honest review and a rating. That also means a lot to us. And if you don't like this video, you can hit the thumbs down button twice and that will really let me know that you didn't like it. But you got to hit it 2 times if you didn't like it. Now, once won't do it. You got to hit the thumbs down button twice, and that'll really let me know that I need to improve here. So everyone, thank you so much, and we will talk to you again, and stay retro, everyone.